What's happening, YouTube? It's Simon466cards, and today we're going to talk about Beckett slabs. In the past, I've made quite a few videos talking about Beckett's business and their finances, but today we're focusing on the Beckett slabs themselves and nothing to do with the business. We're going to start off and look at some grading numbers that have been supplied by GemRate. Shout out to Ryan there. We're going to move into some interesting data that Ryan has sent me from GemRate, and then we'll end up talking about what happens to cards in Beckett slabs and then their values as well. So that's the plan for today. The first data point to look at from a grading perspective is pretty obvious. It is just how many cards are being graded by Beckett each month. And so you can see this data goes back to 2022. So we have 3 years worth of data from January 2022 all the way to January 2025. You'll note that there is a data point missing for July. I'm not sure what the data issue was there, but we don't have the data point. And that is consistent as we move along here. Now you'll see here from January to June of 2022, things are going all right. Things are going up. But then from the second half of 2022 onwards, it's been pretty flat. And then in the second half of 2024, you'll see that there has been a big drop. Now, there was a recovery in January of 2025. We will see whether or not that trend continues in February, in a couple weeks here. But overall, they are at a level lower than 2022, which obviously is not the case when you compare them to PSA or to SGC. So that is the overall big picture, but I don't find this view to be very interesting. And I think there's a much more interesting way to look at this data. And so I asked Ryan from GemRate to send me a cut of the data looking at the breakdown between sports and TCG slabs being made by Beckett each month. And this is a much more interesting graph to me. You can see blue here is sports, orange is TCG. In the first half of 2022, Beckett was churning out sports slabs, but it was just getting traction with the TCG market. Again, here's that data point where we're missing July data. But ever since then, it's been neck and neck each month, 50-50 between sports and TCG. And if you look at the number of slabs being produced at for sports cards, you'll see that even with that January recovery, it's still below 30,000, which is below the level it was consistently at from 2022 to all the way to what is that? Midway through 2024, and now it is consistently under 30K, and that I think is very notable. I think that reflects the lack of trust in sports cards in terms of grading with Beckett and the sports cards community, and I don't think that's a shock to any of you. But having said all that, there's still another way to look at this data that I think is even more interesting, and that's to look at the percentage split between TCG and sports. And this is what I find the most interesting. Blue is sports, orange is TCG again, and you can see in that first half of 2022, it started in the 80-90% range and dropped all the way down to 50, and it's been hovering in that 50 range over the last couple of years. But now, 2 months in a row, less than 50% of the cards graded at Beckett were TCG, or were sports. More than 50% were with TCG. It's happened 2 months in a row previously, earlier in 2024, but this is not a good trend for the sports card business at Beckett. I think looking at this, it's pretty obvious that TCG is taking over, and to that I say, I think the chase for the black label in TCG is very real, and likely what is driving the increase on this TCG side. But on the sports card side, this is troubling. This again reflecting what I was saying earlier in the video. This is to me, a lack of confidence in Beckett from the sports card side of things. And the next question is obviously what happens to the value of sports cards in Beckett slabs? And that's what I'm going to talk about next, because I want to illustrate what I think will happen to card values with the following scenario. Let's use this hypothetical situation where you own an 86 Fleer Michael Jordan in a BGS 9 slab. Currently, on Card Ladder, all the stuff I'm about to show you is from Card Ladder, the value is $11,000 in a BGS 9. And what I think is going to drive the value of BGS slabs is what values are in PSA slabs. And here's what they are in a PSA 9, 8, and 7. I'm going to assume that a BGS 9 will not grade a 10. And in this instance, you can see a PSA 9 is 19K, a BGS 9 is 11K. So not quite double, but significantly more. A PSA 8 is 7,100, and a PSA 7 is 4,750. And so really what this comes down to is whether or not it's worth it to crack the BGS 9 out and put it in a PSA slab, whether or not you're willing to risk it to go from 10,800 to 19,100, with the downside being 7,100 and possibly even 4,750 if you get a 7 out of it. And to me, that is what is going to drive the values of BGS going forward. It will have nothing to do with Beckett values themselves. It will be just solely driven by the cost benefit of each slab, and because of that, it will really depend on the condition of the card, right? Because there is a BGS 9 slab that out there that probably looks like it can get a PSA 9, and then there are some that are graded a little bit more generously, let's say, and is more likely to be between a 7 and an 8. And so if you think a card has a shot at a 9 with the downside being an 8, and you think it's 50-50, you're going to do this math every single time, and you're going to crack it out of the BGS 9 slab because you have an upside of 8,300 and a downside of 3,700. Those are great odds. And that, to me, is what the math will be. Whereas if you think this BGS 9 is actually overgraded a little bit and it's only going to be an 8 or a 7, you'll never crack the slab. You'll just keep it in the BGS 9 slab. And that math there is going to dictate the value of BGS 9 slabs going forward, because if the BGS 9 values get too high, nobody is going to want to buy them because there's no upside. Like if the BGS 9 here was like 15 or 16, nobody's going to buy at that price, and the price will fall because the upside is only 4K. Whereas if the BGS 9 is then equal to a PSA 8, then people are going to be buying those all day because it's basically a free roll to get a PSA 9 with the downside being a PSA 8, right? That is what I believe will drive the Beckett slab market going forward. It will just be, where does it sit between the grades in a PSA slab? And so that is my first prediction. BGS values will be dictated solely by the cost benefit of cracking and setting to PSA. And the equilibrium will be somewhere between what the grade is in a PSA slab and then one grade below. So you can see here, the BGS 9 is going to be below the PSA 9, but above the PSA 8, because it has to be somewhere in between. If it was too low, if it was below the PSA 8 value, then obviously people are going to snatch those up and crack them and send them to PSA. And conversely, if it's too high, nobody's going to buy them and then it'll fall back down. And this is because BGS slabs, I believe, and the data I showed you earlier shows it, BGS slabs aren't valued by the sports card community as much anymore. And it is just all deferential to PSA now. That is my first prediction. My second prediction, and this first prediction I don't think is that much of a shock. You know, this makes sense, right? My second prediction, though, is I think more unique, and it's that as a result of this math, the only cards that will remain in BGS slabs are cards that are overgraded. Because if this is the math, right, that you see on your screen for this BGS 9, If you think it is a BGS 9 that will either be a PSA 9 or a PSA 8, you will crack that slab every single time and roll the dice to see if you can get a PSA 9 and make $8,300 because it's worth it. Even if you get an 8, the upside was there for a PSA 9. Conversely, if you have a slab in a BGS 9 holder, but it's overgraded and it'll more likely be a PSA 8 or a PSA 7, you're not going to crack it. You're going to leave it in the slab as a BGS 9. And so that is going to result in my prediction number 2, which means that all the cards that are graded fairly and will likely end up in a grade that is similar in a PSA 9 in a PSA slab will be cracked and submitted to PSA. All the cards that are overgraded in a BGS slab and are unlikely to get an equal grade in a PSA slab will remain in their BGS slab. So the only cards left in this case a BGS 9 slab are the cards that are more likely to end up being a PSA 7 and 8 because it's not worth it to crack it. And that, I believe, is going to be this snowball effect, because then as more people do this math and play this game of cracking and submitting, the only cards left will be all cards that are overgraded. And then us as a community will just notice that all of the BGS 9 slabs kind of look like they were graded poorly by BGS because they all look like they should be 7s and 8s. And then it's going to reinforce this idea and this notion that Beckett overgrades their cards, when in fact it's just a sampling issue. All the fairly graded cards have now been cracked and submitted to PSA. All the cards that have been overgraded remain in their Beckett slabs, and it'll make it seem like Beckett's graders were very lenient when in fact just all of the fair grades have been cracked and subbed to PSA. So those are my 2 predictions as to what will happen to Beckett slabs and Beckett prices going forward. The Beckett prices will be driven solely by where they fall relative to a PSA, and if it goes too low, people are going to snatch them up and crack and submit it to PSA. Secondly, only overgraded Beckett slabs are going to remain in Beckett slabs. Otherwise, those cards are being cracked and submitted to PSA to hopefully go from a BGS 9 to a PSA 9 or a BGS 8 to a PSA 8, because the upside is there, because nobody wants Beckett slabs just for the sake of having Beckett slabs anymore. And I'm saying nobody, I'm being very general. Obviously, there are some people who like Beckett slabs, and that's fine. And in fact, I think they look pretty good. But I'm talking about the overall hobby as a whole, right? So that's it. That's the video. Would love to hear your thoughts and comments about these 2 predictions that I have, and also on the data that I showed earlier in the video. Thank you as always for listening and watching. I'll talk to you all soon. Cheers.